It should. All right, great. Well, good day and good afternoon and good evening for those joining us from overseas. The last couple of days have been really exciting in terms of the content and the discussion. This is one of the most important topics that we have actually lined up for this summit to consider the fact that critical infrastructure by itself could be a complete summit in itself, representing 16 different sectors formally and many different that are tied around it. So in this session, we want to talk about at least a few of them, and I think we have a pretty good representation for those that are really at the top of that chart. And we want to get off, kick this off with a opening statement from our good friend Ed Dolansky. We announced Ed to the Executive Advisory Council for 2021. So great to have you, Ed, and your support for the year that we have kind of collaborated together and actively will work towards implementing a lot of the. I mean, I've got bullet lists of full of stuff that we have to go and do now. And thank you for joining us in that. And I think in our past conversations we have spoken about the trifecta of 5G, quantum, and AI. And I think all that impacts the critical infrastructure in one way or the other. So love to get your thoughts on what keeps you up at night as an executive, and then also thoughts on how can executive leadership at the critical infrastructure, both public and private sector, can help support the cybersecurity as well as overall security initiatives that would drive this action forward. So over to you, Ed, and all the best to this panel. Thank you so much.
Val, thank you for the introduction, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. It's a pleasure to absolutely be on here. And Val, thank you for the invite to join the Executive Advisory Board. And I'm excited about engaging on an official basis going forward. I'm joining you actually right now from the Space Coast. So I think it's appropriate that we're down here in Titusville, Florida for a Atlas V launch that's going to be taking place for the NRO, a classified payload here in the next couple of days. But there was a reason why our president launched an additional service branch for space. And as Val and I have talked coming up to this event, there is a merge of space and cyber that are coming together, and there's not a lot of people thinking about it as we go forward. So, look, I just recently retired from Boeing. I was the president of the U.S. government defense services business, about $10 billion annual revenue. And we had a lot of projects. We had about 800 and some programs that were active. But when Val asked me what would keep me up at night, I'll tell you that cyber was by far my greatest concern. As Val put it, as we see the advent of 5G, i.e. someone can be local from across the world with zero lag time, artificial intelligence, which we were investing hundreds of millions of dollars in every year, combined with the power of quantum, it creates a scenario that in the wrong hands, I am very concerned, as well as many others, that it could take our existing encryption technologies and obsolete them overnight. I was on a CMMC discussion not too long ago, and I was asked to comment at the end of it. And I said, well, this is a great conversation. I appreciate all the standards that are going on, but with the advent of quantum, this is all going to be obsolete. And we need to be thinking beyond this. How do you quantum proof communication? So those three are something we were concerned about a great deal. In particular, it wasn't the overt attack we were worried about. We know when we're under attack. I mean, I can't quote the number, the violation of my COI with Boeing on the tens of thousands we would get per day. It's the attack you don't know that happened is what we were worried about. Someone coming in and changing a measurement, if you will, and then it's setting out there and allowing to compound over a period of time. And then just when you least expect it, the problem has occurred, and an adversary has timed their attack appropriately with it. Some people will look at me and say, well, give me an example of that. And I said, well, it wasn't cyber, but I'll give you the perfect example of that. And that is the Battle of the Bulge. Hitler would have gone all the way to Belgium if they wouldn't have ran out of fuel. That's all that stopped them. The tanks ran out of fuel. Now imagine if a cyber attack on a given country and their military changed the quantity that's in a liter, but it was so small you didn't know it. It wasn't overt, but it slowly built over time to where the supply chain reserves were depleted, and it took a couple of weeks to get it built back up again. That would absolutely be devastating. So that was something that was on our mind, was how do we harden the supply chain? How do we harden all aspects of comms? I love the saying, anybody who's read a couple of books that are out there right now, they talk about the next major conflict. It won't start with a boom. It will start with, why aren't my lights working? It will start with, why has the ATM machine? Why can't I get my money out? It will be out to create disarray in a society. It will be out for there to be denial. That is absolutely going to be how one of these start, or it will be the precursor to the kinetic war itself. There are countries, there are companies that are working on that on both sides of that coin, whether you're on the defensive side or you're helping with defending our freedom on the offensive side. It is real. So that's why this particular panel was of interest to me when I heard about its focus on infrastructure, because we all know that one of the critical infrastructure elements that we are most concerned about is our electrical grid, and there were active programs around it. Some folks will say, well, but will this ever happen? Quantum. Quantum it's 10 years ahead of its time. Okay. Did anyone think we would be having a virtual conversation 1 year ago? Anybody think there would be a virus? If you did, then you're probably very rich by playing the stock market and shorting things. No one thought we would be here. I firmly believe it's going to take one attack, and it will be a similar situation as COVID it was as a surprise, and how it will virtually change the way encryption is utilized, and where this is going to end up taking us. What I'm very pleased with is how the Cyber Future Foundation is taking this head on, and the vision around having a common focus, approach, measurement, certification to where companies will have a common denominator, if you will, to how we approach this and the ideas are approached. In closing, before I turn this over to Norma, one of the other points I was asked to talk about was, how do you get the C-suite's attention? Look, everyone, I mean, every day there were X number of sales folks trying to get a meeting with us, wanting to sell us something. What would get our attention was when someone would talk to me about something that impacts cost or impacts my profitability. I could be more profitable. Now, many of the folks on this call, you're in the technical community and you're technical experts in your areas. You may say, but there's risk, there's risk. Of course, that I'm going to be interested in it. But the very next question is going to be, what's the cost to make that risk go away? What's the cost if the risk is allowed to come to fruition? It truly is. We as executives, we're paid to drive earnings per share. Earnings per share are driven by profitability and cost on the other side of it. So if you want to get the attention, if you want to get into the meeting, have the conversations, talk to the executives about a cost containment opportunity, or on how you can drive additional profitability. And I know that's a bit nebulous for everyone, but you just have to put yourself in the mindset of the number of challenges that are hitting some of the large OEMs that are out there, and we only have so much time, and we're trying to have family lives at the same time. So the focus is going to be built around the performance of our given organizations. So focus in that arena. You will get a meeting every day with an executive. It'll be very easy to do. So with that, I'm going to turn this over to Norma, and I hope you all enjoy a very, very informative panel.
Thank you very much, Ed. Val, I didn't know did you want to say anything before we tee up the panel?
No, I think it's ready for you, Norma. I would not want to take any more time away from this great conversation that's ahead of us. So thank you, Ed. And
thank
over
you.
To you,
Well,
Norma.
thank you, Val. Thank you, Ed. And thank you for those who are joining us today. We have a terrific panel. And we have so many exciting things to talk about. And sometimes it's always a question of where to start. But first, let me introduce myself. My name is Norma Cram, and I'm the Vice President of Cybersecurity, Privacy, and Digital Innovation at Vanscoy Associates. I've spent half of my career in government, so I'm so pleased today to be joined with Alan and Greg, and half in industry. And Tobias understands some of these issues that I'm going to talk about as well. From my vantage point, I work with owners and operators of critical infrastructure on managing their cybersecurity risk, really focusing on the day-to-day challenges that Ed talked about, and that is, how do you get the C-suite to pay attention? And I will say this, I think we have seen a great change in the last 10 to 15 years. And I say that because I created a cybersecurity practice actually in 2005. Now, I will admit, at that point, about 15 years ago, I felt like I was evangelizing in the wind when we talked about cyber risk to critical infrastructure, right? Every time I would talk about a scenario, as Ed said, the lights go down. We'll talk about GPS spoofing and other things. Everyone said that it must be an episode of the Homeland TV show, but that is not what we're talking about. But there has been a systemic change. And when we talk to the C-suite, and we're going to talk about key issues today, we're really talking about enterprise risk management. Cyber is a systemic risk. And the easiest way to make people understand at the end of the day is cyber will stop you from doing whatever it is that you're supposed to be doing. Keep the lights on, deliver the mail, make sure that there's money in your banking account, right? All those things that we need. And certainly in the middle of COVID, we have seen what those impacts are. Now, the piece that's important, and we're going to talk a lot about this today with the panel, is really the national security and the homeland security implications of these issues. And the sectors we're going to talk about as well are going to be very global. And I learned that early in my career when I was focusing on international trade issues at the Commerce Department. So Alan, special kudos to everybody at the Commerce Department working in ITA, but I also worked at the State Department, FEMA, and the Department of Transportation. And so to me, as we talk about critical infrastructure, if you know how to build it, you know how to fix it, you know how to secure it, and you actually know really how to run and operate systems. And ultimately, cybersecurity must be a core part of that. So it is particularly exciting to introduce the panel that we have today, not just because it is Cybersecurity Month, and we all are spending a lot of time on this, but there are so many important topics we're going to jump into. So I'm going to do quick introductions of the panel. Everyone is going to give about 5 to 7 minutes just of the top issues that are core to their mind. But then we're going to drill into some issues like supply chain security issues. We'll talk about AI. We'll talk about some of the other tech issues that really matter the most. So I'm going to start with our government speakers. They always get, we'll give you the kudos first, and then we'll give you the hard questions. Tobias, you'll get the easy questions. So we have with us today Gregory Crabb, who is the VP and CISO at the U.S. Postal Service. A tough job in this day and age, so thank you for all that you do. He actually came from a career in law enforcement, and so he understands, how all these issues go together. His job is to protect the Postal Service, both the employees, the customers, and the information systems against digital threats. And we're talking about a very complex environment of digital handheld devices and broad automation equipment. Then we have Dr. Alan Friedman from NTIA. He did share with me a very funny introduction, which I will not use. But Alan is the Director of Cybersecurity Initiatives at the National Telecommunications Information Agency, or NTIA, the Commerce Department. He is coordinating NTIA's multi-stakeholder cybersecurity process, focusing on open software systems and transparency, which we affectionately call SBOM. He survived a 15-year notable career working in tech policy at Harvard's Computer Science Department, Brookings, and GW. And we have Tobias Whitney, who's working in the energy industry, and he leads the sales and marketing as Vice President of Energy Solutions at Fortress Solutions. He's worked across many years in EPRI and really understands the ICS security system. And he actually he created a security practice in Burns and McDonnell. So we're going to talk about the energy sector, obviously the Postal Service. Alan's going to talk about cross-sector risk, but I'd also like to talk about financial services, banking, transportation, ISPs. But before we do that, I'm first going to go to Greg. Greg, talk a little bit about your role at the Postal Service, and then we'll go to Alan and then Tobias after that.
Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. Thank you very much, Norma, for inviting me on the panel and for your introduction. The Postal Service is obviously a national critical infrastructure in the country. And we have a very vast network of trucks and facilities on the street and in your communities. 31,000 facilities, 225,000 vehicles on the streets every day, delivering to 160 million addresses across the United States. And protecting that infrastructure is extremely important. We do a lot at the Postal Service in order to be able to deliver a mature information security practice. And as I consider those components that are necessary in order to be able to protect critical infrastructure, some of the things that are most important are managing cybersecurity risk and understanding how the technology assets of your organization are used to deliver value and how that value can be hampered as a result of attacks against those technology assets. It's extremely important to have mature conversations about those risk issues at the highest levels of the organization and get executive buy-in from making deliberate decisions about how to manage the risk, also deliberate decisions on how to invest to mitigate those risks. In addition to protecting the assets of the United States Postal Service, I serve as the chair of the IT Security Experts Panel at a United Nations specialized organization called the Universal Postal Union. And through that forum, we coordinate the best security practices. We try to offer an examination and define the best practices that National Postal Administration should make. Last year, we completed a study of the maturity of cybersecurity practices across postal administrations around the world. We had 61 of the 192 member countries respond. We learned that the most important aspects for postal administrations to develop, and I think these are common practices that all organizations should consider, because some of these postal administrations are in least developed countries, others in developing countries, and then the industrialized countries. We advocate for the establishment of a formal cybersecurity program, identifying and assessing third-party risks that exist to technology assets, developing a cybersecurity awareness and training program for not only your employees, but also your most critical business partners from a technology perspective, identifying and sharing information that relates to cyber threats that could impact your entity, and then fundamentally knowing and creating an inventory of all of your information assets, information and technology assets, because if you don't see them, you can't protect them. And being able to put a container around those, and that's a very basic set of guidelines around how I view helping the world's postal administrations protect their critical infrastructure. We do that in the United States Postal Service on a much greater scale than those basic concepts. And there's a lot of other things that I could talk about, but I'll turn it back over to you, Norma, to continue the dialogue.
Great. Thank you for that. That tees up a lot of the questions we're going to talk about today. But it also is a terrific tee up for Alan. So Alan, why don't you talk a little bit about what you've been focused on and an inventory of assets? That sounds like something you're interested in, Alan.
It definitely is. Thank you, Norman, and Greg. Thanks for all your hard work. Hopefully, all of us know that pretty much step zero in any cybersecurity plan, regardless of what sector you're in, is know what you have. Can't defend what you don't know about. The challenge is across all of the 16 critical infrastructure sectors that Val talked about that the US defined, or the 9.5 that Brussels currently has. I always forget the exact measure they have. But anyway, all of us build on software. Right? The famous phrase is that software has eaten the world. And while there are very real differences about whether you're moving 5G signals or water around a country, we're all using software. And the challenge is software isn't hewn out of whole alabaster marble by tonsured monks on Greek islands, right? Software is assembled out of other pieces of software, and it's software all the way down. And sometimes, knowing that I have a big piece of software, that's enough, right? This is made by one of the top 10 vendors in the world. And so I know that I have it, and if it needs to be updated, they'll tell me. This is great. The problem is most of the software that we depend on doesn't meet that description. It's made by smaller organizations, or it's assembled out of other things. Now, if you go to the grocery store and you buy a piece of candy, it's going to come with a list of ingredients. What baffles me is why we don't have the same expectation for the software that's in our critical infrastructure. And that's really what we're trying to do at NTIA, is to create both the technical and the operational or business side of thinking about what transparency looks like in the software supply chain. So I'm going to give you a quick story about why we desperately need this. Over the summer, an Israeli security research company named JSOF, found a vulnerability in a small TCP/IP library called Trek. Now, this library is in turn used in a bunch of smaller systems that are used in larger systems. So much are used in real-time operating systems. Real-time operating systems are an integral part of a whole bunch of critical infrastructure, everything from jet fighters to cell phone towers. The challenge is the researchers didn't know which vendors to say, hey, the things that you're selling to your customers that are running in critical infrastructure might be vulnerable. They couldn't even tell the manufacturers, let alone the customers. One of the things they had to do was they had to go on LinkedIn and search for who had claimed to have expertise in the Trek TCP/IP library, figure out where they worked, and said, well, maybe this company is now shipping a product with this just because of who was involved. So that's the level of where we are without this level of transparency. However, getting this transparency isn't something we can magically do. This is a market problem. It's not just a technical problem. We have to think about it from the supply side and the demand side. We have to help customers want to ask for it, which means we have to help them derive value, but also help suppliers, people who make software, realize that it's beneficial to them. And because we're the Commerce Department, we're trying to do this without regulation. So our vision here is to say, let's show that this is something that industry can work on and derive benefit themselves. So we've brought together as many different stakeholders from the software community as we could find. Everything from the open source community to middleware and small software developers, to some of the largest tech providers in the world, not just America, but around the world. And of course, the end customers, banks, utilities, hospitals, to sort of say, what's the value here? And again, going back to this idea of this has to be a cross-sector effort. We're all using the same software. A lot of it's open source. So and it would be disadvantageous to have a DoD-specific solution and a space-specific solution, because again, that just means that the suppliers are now going to have to do things many more different ways. It's going to create costs. It's going to leave cracks for error. So because we have this very broad scope, we're trying to focus on a very narrow layer. We're just interested in the software, and we want this to dock with all these other efforts in software assurance and supply chain security. So we're making a lot of progress. I'm happy to chat more about that. There are a lot of fun policy challenges, and there's some standards challenges as well. We didn't want to create a brand new standard, and so we're focusing on making sure that the work that exists today.
That's exactly right. Well, thank you so much for that. As I was trying to explain the SBOM to someone the other day, I said, just think of it as the Skippy jar, right? You are the Skippy jar. You just need to tell me what's in there and it makes my life easier. But part of what you're talking about is that trust factor that, and I'll put in air quotes as well, that companies have in critical infrastructure with their vendors and their supply chain. And the energy sector is a very unique one. And Tobias, I know that's really one place where you have great expertise. And I'm looking forward to talking about all of that's happening in the electric utility sector, but over to you.
Okay, well, thanks for that segue. Tobias Whitney, Vice President of Energy Solutions here at Fortress Information Security. For those that don't know who Fortress Information Security is, it's just like Norma said. We're focused on critical infrastructure, primarily for electric power, but critical infrastructure full stop, DoD and other areas. So some of the things that I think that are important, some of the things that we're focusing on is what we call illumination of the supply chain. That's a little bit of what Alan had mentioned. As if you look at electric power, 10 years ago, a little bit over 10 years ago, this industry put together a pretty comprehensive set of cybersecurity standards. They were called the Critical Infrastructure Protection Standards. And at the time, I actually spent 6 years managing and facilitating and evangelizing, if you will, the cybersecurity standards for NERC, North American Electric Reliability Corporation. And over the last 10 years or so, we've been focusing on ensuring that utilities are addressing all the basic hygienes from a security perspective. Are we implementing patches appropriately? Are we securing the critical infrastructure that keeps our lights on? But over recent years, we realized that was only half the battle. And we were addressing focusing on efforts around the asset owners and the operators in the facilities and the utilities that ultimately are used to govern that infrastructure. But no one was asking the question about, what about the vendors? What about the OEMs? What about the manufacturers? I can only keep the lights on by managing the systems that are used to do just that. But most utilities don't use homegrown systems. They're completely dependent on the vendor and manufacturing community. So in the last few years, and that's really where we've been focusing on here at Fortress, is a simple way to describe it is the risk of a common mode failure. Okay, and Alan touched on this a little bit with software BOBs, is that we know that we only have a finite set of vendors and manufacturers and software providers in the world. And then if you look at that on a per vertical perspective, you get smaller and smaller sets. So the question is, okay, if we're spending all of our times inside our four walls, trying to do everything that we can do to manage and maintain and have a high cybersecurity hygiene, what are we doing to make sure that if we're not addressing the vendor risk, that how are we ultimately mitigating the risk of a common mode failure? The common mode failure is this for utilities, and that's the thing that kind of keeps me up at night, is what if through a multinational, a global organization has malware, some upset person in the company. They slip in some code in the back door. That's what we're talking about with the software bill of materials. Now that RTU, remote terminal unit, or the relay that's used on the bulk electric system, or the controller used at power plants and substations that we're dependent on from a infrastructure perspective has now been infiltrated. We have malware introduced. Well, the challenge is most utilities are going about their daily business. Most critical infrastructures are going about their daily business. They're completely dependent on things such as SARBOX and ISO 27000 and FedRAMP Gov. And we're making the assumption that all these controls are getting all the way down to the granular level of the programmer, of the engineer, of the device manufacturer, of the fourth party supplier. But that's not really necessarily a true story. We don't have a tremendous amount of standardization on how the components and software is ultimately designed. And then when you introduce that to major critical infrastructure devices and systems, we can have a major issue. If any one common system is exploited and then potentially used on the grid, that can cause numerous systems to potentially misoperate at the same time. That's the thing that we're worried about from a utility and critical infrastructure perspective. So what we do and what I've been focusing on is how do we illuminate those issues? How do we illuminate the vendors that have potential relationships with foreign adversarial countries. We hear the term now called near-peer foreign adversaries. You know, China, Russia, North Korea. I don't think anyone's buying technology from there, in places like that, right? And but that's not where you stop. Okay, where are we hiring people from? How can they be leveraged? How can they be put in a situation that for the technologies and for the systems that they're ultimately manufacturing and designing that we can ultimately trust here in the various places that we work across the globe. So, so we manage a information sharing, or what we call a community-based sharing environment that allows for utilities and OEMs and manufacturers to share best practices to illuminate the supply chain in a way that's cost effective, so that not every single buyer has to reach out to every single potential seller and negotiate each one of these contracts from a security perspective uniquely. We need to recognize economies of scale, and that's what we do.
Great. Well, a couple quick things, and then I'm going to jump into questions. One, I hope all the other sectors who are listening continue to be jealous, only because the energy sector right now is the only industry that is allowed to write its own regulations in the NERC SIP process, which I guess we're in the 21st to 22nd century. That's pretty amazing. You better hold on to that while you still can. But there are cultures per sector, at least in my experience, having worked across most of the major critical infrastructure sectors, about understanding cybersecurity risk. In the energy sector, my experience is they tend to say, we're so heavily regulated, we don't need any more. People will say, we don't, I'm too small, no one's going to come find me. And some of these sort of awareness issues, I think we have to change and modify over time, which is why everything that the three of you are doing is so important. I'm going to focus, we're going to spend a lot of time today on different aspects of supply chain issues and sort of managing tech risk, but I'm going to play off of one point that Tobias mentioned, and that is when we think about national security risks in a supply chain, it also comes from particular vendors, and it may be because they come from countries that have laws on the books that force them to do certain things. And so the White House issued, as we all know, an ICT executive order some time ago. Now that was certainly focused particularly on Huawei and ZTE, but there is a very complicated process. I mean, all of the sectors and sourcing are very international in nature, certainly as I want to spend a lot of time on trade. So let's talk a little bit about just that particular piece. As we think about certain vendors or country of origin or just sourcing, we'll get into more supply chain issues a little bit differently. How do each of you, or what would you recommend are the keys to successfully managing the tech risk that comes from looking at those two particular issues?
I'll start. So I gotta give you one horror story, right? So one of the challenges that I'd say that we wouldn't want to do, and I'm not picking on any particular company, and I hear this often, it's like, I buy all my technology software from, say, an integrator like a CDW. I'm not picking on anyone, a company like that. But what happens is when you utilize a reseller that's centralized like that, and you buy in servers and switches and technology and gear and devices behind that ultimately that reseller is ultimately selling to you, what we're not getting is rich information about the individual products, systems, and hardware that were actually being utilized within their systems in our environment. So the recommendation is to get granular, okay? Understand who our third parties are. There's processes to gain information about who they are, what their whereabouts are, what controls they have in place, but more importantly, what will the system or the service that you're buying from that third party, what is it going to do to your environment? I think too often many of our companies that are on the buy side of this just assume that high-level policy and procedure verifications, attestations are good enough. And for small companies that you're serving, getting various services from or products from, that may be okay. But for some of the larger companies that have complex manufacturing processes, complex facilities and locations all across the globe, those standards may not always matriculate to the individual location where your technology and product is being developed and manufactured. So the point is that for larger companies, don't just scope this away as something that you can just rely on as it relates to certain standards and policies. You have to go a little bit further than that. Understand the total reach of third parties that you're working with, but get more granular and understand the individual product and or service impact that technology may introduce to your environment.
So, there are keys to a successful supply chain sort of vendor management program. The piece I'm really particularly focusing on, because I think companies and entities have a hard time with it. And so maybe Alan and Greg, you can talk about this too. You can't boil the ocean on a supply chain even if you're big or small. So sometimes that layered security approach is really the big issue. And honestly, if you know that the federal government has already mandated that you cannot work with specific vendors because of certain risk, you gotta lop off the easiest piece. So Alan, I know that you look at some of these issues, and Greg, you have a different perspective since you're a quasi-governmental entity. But let's talk about that high level U.S. defining nation state risks, right? We have OFAC, there are sanctions. How can you work on that?
So, I think we can look at it from the I just need to check a box versus I need to be affirmative about the risks. And what I like about transparency as an enabler on both sides is it really helps us deliver. So let's look at sort of the basic compliance model, right? The thing that we all have to do. Again, something your board is going to care about. The U.S. government recently, actually not even that recently, a couple of years ago, made a decision that said that a certain piece of antivirus software represents a threat to American networks, American government networks, American national security. Said we need to get it off all federal networks, civilian and defense. The challenge is this wasn't just as easy as everyone just looking at the shelf and saying, well, I don't see a box from that company, so I don't have it. Because again, we use software and other pieces of software and other pieces of software. And by the way, once we get into embedded devices, it gets even more complicated. So transparency through software bill of materials and other tools allows us to have that. So it's very hard to actually execute on any of these policies unless companies start asking for it. And at a certain point, I think if you're not asking for this from your suppliers, it's not the fact that you don't know isn't going to get you off the hook. So from a demand side, this is the sort of thing that customers are going to start asking for. And so, for example, very few of us would look at healthcare and say they're leading the way in cybersecurity. But this is one of those few areas where I think they've played a real lead, where a number of the biggest hospitals in America are already asking for this information from medical device manufacturers, right? Is what's under the hood in the blinking box that's keeping grandpa alive. At the other end, for folks who want to be a little more affirmative in risk, I think transparency can also play a similar role, because one of the key risks we often think about is not that I'm buying from a company, because I know that North Korea isn't making one of the parts that's going into my satellite, but this satellite uses a lot of open source. And there's some risk there. Now, I talked to some folks in the Pentagon who say, oh, the solution is just we don't trust open source. Good luck having any software at all, right? The world is now built on open source. But once I know what open source I have, then I can just watch that. And I can set up automated surveillance using AI because it turns out that it's really hard to inject backdoors in a truly open project without being able to detect it in an automated, scalable fashion. So I think we're going to see a lot more expectation for that. And by the way, that's a huge opportunity for market growth for those of you who are trying to think about the future of where we need innovation. There are going to be a lot of people looking for help in that space.
Right. Well, Greg, now you have a very unique approach as a public-private entity. So how do you... there's no risk. We don't worry about the Postal Service and your cyber.
Not important at all. No, not today at all.
or 5 days from now.
Yeah, exactly. No, I think that a lot of Tobias and Alan brought up a lot of very good points. And I want to focus on the relationship with the procurement process and look at the procurement process from a risk-based approach, recognizing that you have to have an integration of security, technology, engineering, and operations kind of coming together to make sure that technology risks are looked at for each procurement that's made. And recognize that if it touches the network, it's in scope relative to what you need to do in order to be able to protect your infrastructure. The next is having a set of security standards, and whether you reference NIST standards or ISO standards or your own industry proprietary standards, I think it's very important to assure that those standards are put forward in RFPs, trickle down to contracts. Those are very important. And then Alan and Tobias talked about, obviously, and you led in, there's certain vendor categories, vendor sourcing locations that we need to look at relative to the defense interests of the networks that we're trying to protect. And then in those contracts, provide audit rights, be able to go in and assess the performance of your vendor against a set of standards that you can look at when you need to. And I think there's been a lot of very good conversation. That's, I think, an area that those procurement items are really what's important in my view.
That's exactly right. And I will say again, working with other sectors, there has been quick adoption in some, slow in others, to understand that you have to, at the bare minimum, ensure that in your procurement process, you are first clearly identifying that there are cybersecurity standards that whoever replies to the RFP must meet. And then whether it's, government procurement or just sort of private sector procurement, there also have to be very specific cybersecurity requirements in the contract itself, which gives you the ability to audit your vendors, Greg, as you're talking about. And I would also argue that you should try, if you can, to put in sort of mandatory breach reporting back to you, even if, the definitions of breach reporting in the 50 states don't match. If they don't have to report to a state, it doesn't mean they don't have to report to you. So I think people do need to focus very much on that. That's really important. The piece I'm not going to talk about privacy in this panel, but the piece that GDPR, I think, did try and help educate people about is the terms they use are controller processor relationships, but it forced companies to look at their supply chain and who are they using and for what. And at least that logic flow is helpful when we think about cybersecurity issues. The last thing I'll say, and then I want to jump into one other issue, is the banking financial services sector. And we were going to have a representative on today, and they weren't able to join us. But they were one of the very first sectors through, fortunately or unfortunately, the regulatory process to be mandated that they apply cybersecurity requirements down through the supply chain. And that the bank is the regulated entity, was held responsible for that. So I do think we're going to see more of that as we go forward, and that's going to take me to my next question. Alan is going to love this, so he'll be excited. When we talk about the world of open source software, it's the gift that keeps on giving. Although Virgil did say, "Beware of the stranger bearing gifts," and okay, technically Greeks bearing gifts, but that's okay. The issue, I'm really concerned about, though, is we think ahead to new technology. It could be blockchain, it could be anything. What the entrepreneurial community is doing is taking open source software, using it as a foundation, building things on it. And that covers autonomous vehicles, that covers medical devices, and then we're adding Wi-Fi updates. So I'm asking you all a very hard question to break apart any way that you want. How do we change the culture of the industry to understand that open source software, if you're not understanding where the vulnerabilities are, so let's pretend, Alan, we can't get anyone yet, to adopt SBOM, and we have a problem with latency, right? When there are vulnerability notices posted, people don't do updates, they ignore them, or they say they're too expensive. How do we change the culture in the industry? Because this really underpins really all the issues in the sectors you all work on. So who wants to start? Tobias, I'm going to pick on you in the energy sector first, because we can talk about DER attached to the grid and.
No, they're not every grid connected device is the same. Okay, so if you look at it from a risk management perspective, open source, there's obvious areas of application where open source technology may work. it may be less risky to you as an organization as you're applying those technologies. So the idea here is, yes, if you're using it for electric vehicles or autonomous vehicles, and that could have potential life or death impact on that particular that particular scenario, then that's probably where we need to be a little bit more focused on how and where we're leveraging open source technologies in those cases. Same thing if you look at it for core grid systems and bulk power system grid components for those that are interested in that. The idea here is that we're probably not going to be relying on open source for the most ultimately impactful critical infrastructure components that could be keeping our lights on. So some of that we're probably going to see a lot more specificity in terms of the users and the buyers saying, hey, I need to know what the devices are doing. I need to know what software is there, and I need to know what assurances that you can provide for me for those technologies that are critical. But so that's really the step, is to understand where these technologies could be applied, where it may be more appropriate for you as an organization to use open source.
Okay. Greg?
I have a lot of thoughts in this area, Norma, and although open source you can really point to as a bad apple, I would argue that I get quite a few times where I've got to update my Microsoft infrastructure pretty quickly because of vulnerabilities that have been identified, and I can speak to a number of victims that are third parties of mine that have paid the price as a result of not responding to that patch management construct. But to build on what Tobias is talking about, I think as I hear about IoT and where the marketplace is going, there's this like implied suggestion that this is untrusted software development that's coming into our environments. And from my perspective, if it's important to your business, you should be very deliberate in the trusted execution and the business logic that's tied to that trusted execution for your business value, and expect for your key value, business value, and hardware to run in extremely adversarial conditions. The Postal Service in the late 90s promulgated a postage meter program. It was designed out of Carnegie Mellon University that relies on FIPS 140 devices, and thank God for FIPS 140 and all the work at NIST. And we were very deliberate in assuring that the business logic that's tied to those postage meters runs in a trusted execution environment to assure our revenues. And those devices have allowed for the business growth of the postal industry significantly over the last several years. And I share this as an example because last year, one of my key business partners that delivers those postage meters was victim to a very significant ransomware attack. The beautiful thing that I'm able to do in the last month is attest that the billions of dollars of revenue that came in on those postage meters was accurate for our financial presentation. And it was the assurance that infrastructure is run on trusted equipment. The code has integrity because we use NIST certified labs to assure that, really helps us to provide what we need from an assurance perspective. So if the code is important to you, make sure that you do the due diligence to assure its proper execution for business value. Those are my recommendations. And open source, you get what you pay for. And that's what you have to look out for. So I'll turn it back over to you, Norma.
Okay. No, I think that's really helpful. All right, Alan, back to our Skippy jar. So let's talk about the example you and I have talked about before, which is the partnership that you have on medical devices and how that's evolved.
So I think there's been some amazing work. And as I mentioned before, when it comes to thinking about which community is really leading the way in terms of investment in security. While I love working with my partners in the healthcare space, I don't think most of us would say that healthcare really has had as many resources as, say, the financial sector, or has had the attention devoted to it as national security or something like that. But this has been something that's very important, and some of it goes back to they've faced very real attacks, and unlike a lot of other folks, we're now seeing that cyber attacks are literally a matter of life and death. Some of you saw the headline where there was a claim that ransomware in Germany actually led to some transfer of patients, and during that transfer, a patient passed away, and so people are pointing to this as a first fatality of a cyber attack that we can document. But it goes back beyond that. So, for example, when WannaCry was racing across the internet, the CISO of a very large hospital in America had to pull his staff off the line and have them call all of these vendors saying, for goodness sake, does the blinking box run on Windows or Linux? And the kicker here is that one of the vendors gave the wrong answer. They said it was Linux. It was in fact running Windows. It was vulnerable to the Eternal Blue exploit, and it was not patchable. And so that really was a wake-up call to the sector that they need to get their order together. What they've done is something that I really like, which is a great example of sectoral partnership and also working a little bit with the regulator. So the FDA, which regulates medical devices, has signaled to the medical device community that they're going to require software bill of materials for new devices that go on the sale of the market. So manufacturers now, oh my goodness, we got to pay attention to this. Meanwhile, the hospitals are really excited and say, hey, we want to make sure that we can use this data. So both communities joined this international cross-sector effort to say, let's show what can work. And so a handful of medical device manufacturers, big global companies, have partnered with some of the best hospitals in America to show that the data can be generated and that the data can be consumed. And what I love about this is they're doing it as a proof of concept exercise, one, protected. So they've got NDAs in place so that no one's misusing the data and their regulator can't snoop on them. But they're still sharing all of their lessons out with the broader community. Hey, we tried this. This part was easy. This part was hard. And so they went back to the engineering community and the architecture community and say, hey, we need help solving this problem. So for example, naming of software is a really hard problem. Those of you who are technical, you wouldn't think about it until you try to figure out, hey, does this run on com.sun.java or com.oracle.java? The same piece of software, but it really matters if you need to map it to a database.
Yeah.
And so I'm just going to say, in the middle of the world's worst public health crisis, we have had 6 months of constant progress from some of the hospitals, including, one of the working group leads is the CISO for New York Presby. Talk about being on the front lines. And in the middle of all of this, he only missed 2 meetings. That's how much a priority this is for the healthcare sector, and how successful this kind of collaboration has been.
Thank you, Alan. And it's a terrific example. So I know we're hitting the end of our time. We have about 8 minutes left, so I'm going to do lightning round, 2 more questions, which will test everyone's skill sets. So we can't have a conversation about critical infrastructure without talking about my favorite, most painful issue, which is IT security is not OT and SCADA security. If I have to continue repeating that for 100,000 years, apparently I will do that. So for those, Greg and Tobias, you have very different environments that cover both. But Greg, let's start with you as you talk about how you manage those issues, and then Tobias will jump to you on that one.
Really good question, Norma. OT and IT security are very different, and it's they start fundamentally with that concept of knowing all of the assets that are on your networks. And to the extent that you are able to, in the OT environment, prevent the addition of assets that you're unaware of onto the wire, I think network access control in those environments is very important. I think the ability to keep untrusted content out of that OT environment is another key aspect. And then managing, to the extent that you can, endpoint security in the OT environment. Do what you can. Obviously, those types of production systems are fragile relative to those latent processes for security scanning, and then aggressively examine network traffic and assure that the traffic that's emanating from that infrastructure is what it is. And then I'll end with the thought process of, if you really care about it, make sure that you've got the logic tied to trusted execution. And those are my contributions, Norma.
Great. Now, Tobias, I know in the electric utility industry, we've talked about this for forever. The answer is usually there's a NERC SIP for that, but talk a little bit about that.
Well, there is a NERC SIP for that. IT shall not hang out and touch any of your OT. That's kind of been the deal for quite some time. But the challenge is that IT is kind of getting closer and closer into the traditional OT environments. We're seeing much more COTS-based technologies that are much more ubiquitous. I think the change that we're going to see at some point, we're not going to see it now, we may not see it in the next year or two, but the advent of cloud service providers and off-prem operations and how that may interact with what we traditionally think is OT is not here yet, but that's the next level. But I think one of the other challenges that we're seeing is that we've always talked in electric power that we have a skills gap. We have we don't have the engineers available to support the OT side of the equation. Well, a lot of the challenges is, what you see in Silicon Valley and places like that, and higher education, we're not really focusing on the on the OT side of the equation. So you're typically getting traditional MIS folks or IT people that are trying to leverage into the OT side of the equation. And then that's where we have some challenges. I would recommend, typically though, is that you bring in your IT group and you have them work very closely with the operational people. Just have them spend some time, understand what their priorities are. I usually start with just simply CIA, right? Confidentiality, integrity, and availability. For OT, it's really AIC, availability, integrity, and then confidentiality. And I think if they start understanding it and looking at it from that perspective, it'll help them with that transition from IT to OT.
I mean, if everyone just adopts SBOM, it will just make our life that much easier. And then we know what's in the IT systems. We know what's in the hardware and the software, right, Alan? The one piece you just touched on, and I'll throw this out for a quick one and then go to my last question. The cyber workforce problem continues to be a systemic issue. And in a lot of sectors, banking, financial services sector has worked its way through on kind of roles and responsibilities within organizations, but few others have. Transportation, for instance, as a sector, if you talk to ports or transit, the person who runs security is the chief of police, right? And the IT person their job is to deal with email security. It's not to make sure that the transit entity can run and operate itself. So workforce development is a big issue, standards, other things. I don't know if anyone wants to touch that quickly before we go to our last question.
I can pick it up real quick. It's an area that I'm extremely passionate about, and I've been fortunate enough to leverage Carnegie Mellon University through the FFRDC. As a law enforcement officer, my first 16 weeks on as a law enforcement officer was at the training academy, learning how to do what I do. As soon as I took over the information security practice, I partnered with Carnegie Mellon to do the same thing for my information security professionals and upskill them. I think that's necessary in order to be able to have the foundational skills, and they've got to be much more diverse than being able to just handle the emails. You need a well-rounded information security professional that understands risks, understands all of the control infrastructure, et cetera. And then my last thought is NIST, nice framework. I love it. It was published in August of 2017. It needs an update. We need talent skills that deal with AI and a lot of the discussion that we had today about OT security and other disciplines. So Great question, Norma.
All right, I'm going to skip to lightning round. Quick, most important question. We always say for last. I learned that when I was at the State Department. You'd talk for hours, and you'd have to wait till the very end to figure out what the issue was. So, as we think about CFF and really everyone who's here with us today and broader critical infrastructure, our goal at CFF is to try and identify hard issues that, the four of us can work on through CFF. So, Alan, I'm going to start with you. What's the number one thing that you think we should all work on together, other than the Skippy jar?
Other than the Skippy jar, I think, cheat a minute too. So first, CFF has been doing some great work. Workforce, keep going. But the other thing is using the global perspective to help understand how different parts and initiatives fit together. So SBOM won't solve our problem. CMMC won't solve all our problems. But hey, how do they play together, and what's the gap in between? Where can we help be glue or spackle?
I like it. Okay, Tobias?
I would approach it from the perspective of looking at, hold on, go to Gregory first, come back to me, I'll have it.
Okay, Greg.
I'm going to go back to those key findings from my discussions with the member states of the Universal Postal Union. It's drive a cybersecurity program, know your third-party risks, understand your cyber threats, know your infrastructure assets. It's basic. We need to be able to play the basics, and I'll turn it back to you.
All right,
Okay,
Tobias, and then I'll give you. Go ahead.
So don't look at compliance as the floor, the trip over. Okay, look at compliance and regulatory standards as an enabler and figure out the maximum potential that you can leverage those standards for. Too many folks just say, hey, I have to do this, I have to spend money. If you have to look at it as a have to, you're probably not doing it right.
All right, that's good. That means we get to throw out NERC SIP. No, just kidding. You know what? If I had to ask myself the question, I think what we could all work on and CFF could work on really is cross-sector risk. I think we're still struggling. Each sector is still struggling and focusing on how to manage themselves, and they should. But the elephant in the room is the fact that there is cross-sector risk, and you could do the best job in the universe. And if you don't look at your partners that you need to run and operate, then we're missing the boat. I think, as Donald Rumsfeld would have said, those are the known knowns. And when we talk about cross-sector risk, it is important to look at where there, are reliances and dependencies. And so that's a little bit harder to do. But, at CFF, our job is to find the hard, sticky issues that no one wants to do. And Val will be so proud of me as I say this. So I think we've had a terrific program today. I really want to thank Tobias and Greg and Alan for spending time with me today. We could talk about this for hours. Sorry, Alan. If you want to use Skippy jar, you should feel free, but give me credit for that. And I think working together, we can really help all the sectors that we're focused on increase resiliency. And look, the world of COVID is not going away, unfortunately. We have to be better, smarter, faster as we deal with a lot of these remote issues as well. So on behalf of CFF, thank you all for being here with me today. And I look forward to working with you as we go forward. Stay safe, everybody. Take care.
Thanks, guys.
Bye-bye.